Hello everyone, in this episode of Motive Garage we are assembling the rear suspension into our subframe on our R33 GTR. Well, behind us on the bench is the exploded view of all of our rear suspension for our R33 GTR. We've got the GK Tech suspension arms, we've got our refurbished, strengthened, modified rear subframe, we've got new bushes from Superpro, as well as our repowder coated knuckles, our new hubs. It's all there, and we're going to run you through step by step how we're going to piece all of this together, and most importantly, how all of this stuff works to make our car perform better. So the first thing we need to do is get our knuckle or upright ready so we can assemble the rest of the suspension onto it. We had it completely stripped and refurbished and powder coated by Produce Factory, so it looks nice and new. But basically we need to put in new bushes for the camber arm, the traction rod. We have a aftermarket modified bush that goes into where the high-cast removal for the toe arm goes into the back. We need a new suspension bush, which is where the coilover joins to, and then we need a new seal that goes in the back. Now we picked up Superpro polyurethane style bushes to go in here. Once these have the metal rod through there, they are pretty damn solid and they'll do a good job. And we also got Superpro suspension bush as well. Been using these for a very long time, they work really well. Installation grease to put them in there and make sure they keep moving and don't squeak. So we had to send our knuckle away to the guys at Petters to press in the suspension bush and the tie rod bush. They're a different design to the Superpro one, they're not split, so you need a press to put them in. But the Superpro ones, because they're split in half like this, you slide them in from each side, you can get the steel insert and pliers, and you can get that thing together yourself like this. So a tip for young players, use two at the same time. That way the bush goes in pretty easy. Now the bushes are in the knuckle, so the next thing we have to do is put this seal in behind the hub. A lot of people forget about that. As the hub goes in, that will just push it into place nice and square anyway. We need to make sure that we also have the backing plate that goes in between the hub and the knuckle to get the spacing correct, but it also holds the drum handbrake assembly. So we had this tidied up as well as powder coated by the guys at Produce Factory as well. So one way to do it, drop that in, line all that up, flip this over, go in from this way, get our nice new zinc coated bolts, get them all in and line it up, because as you do it up, it'll pull tight. This is where you'd normally get your torque wrench out and torque these up, but we're just dummy fitting most of the subframe at the moment so we can show you guys how it all goes together. But you want to make sure these are tight for obvious reasons. Your wheels will fall off if they're not. So there it is, hub, knuckle and the handbrake backing plate assembly all together, which means this is ready to go onto our subframe and attach to it via the suspension arms. So now we're going to get the arms ready to go in. First thing we're going to do is install all of the dust boots. This obviously protects the joint from dust, debris, water, etc. If we were only driving it on the track, we wouldn't bother, because that way we could visually inspect the rose joints. But because we're going to use it on the street as well, we are going to put these on. To do that, we have to basically remove every rose joint out of every arm, put the dust boot on, and then reassemble. And the other thing that we'll do is measure the length of the arms to be roughly the same as factory. So when we put it all in the car, we know that we've got roughly factory alignment and we can modify from there. So a tip for young players when you're setting up all new suspension is get your factory arms, run a bolt hole through a bolt hole like that, and then basically just keep adjusting like you would as if it was in the car by twisting that center adjustment until they all line up. See, now they line up, now you know it's the factory length. So a quick tip for young players when you're installing GK Tech lower control arms, what you have to remember is the lower control arm on Sylvia, Skyline, etc. is all pretty much the same, but the big difference with a GTR and a 300ZX is they have an alloy knuckle. So what they do is they have this steel tapered sleeve that goes over the ball joint thread, gets pressed right on, and that ends up inside the knuckle in here, like this. You need to make sure you remove this off the factory lower control arm so you can use it to put the GK Tech lower control arm onto this knuckle. If you forget, it goes wrong real quick. All right, subframe up on the bench now. I'm gonna start with the Hikers Eliminator kit. So it's a whole new bracket. One bolt just goes in where the old Hikers did, and the other one is actually where the arm goes in and also bolts for the subframe. Now, a lot of people out there like to say, and it's half true, that you should always tighten up your suspension arms when the car is fully on the ground and has weight on it. Well, that's kind of true for arms that use a polyurethane or a rubber bush if they have to work against that bush and they store energy in that bush. Sway bars you should definitely do on the ground. But a spherical joint like this, even when completely tight, can move perfectly. No play, it can rotate. So this one you can do up tight out of the car like this, and you don't need weight on the car before you tighten it up. So there are certain ones you can do up tight now, and there are certain ones you need to do up tight on the ground. We'll show you which ones as we go, but you can just tell if it's got the freedom of movement that it needs with a spherical joint, you can do it up outside the car. If it's hard to move and it's in a rubber bush or a polyurethane bush and you can't move it by hand outside the car, well, leave it a little bit loose, put the car on the ground and do it. But see, for us also, the other thing is we will re-spanner check this car completely. We will, when we go to wheel align it properly, we'll undo everything, redo it up again when we go to wheel align it and spanner check it. So for now, it's not even that much of a bigger deal anyway. So that is the Hikers Eliminator kit on. And as you can see now, it's basically the same as having a non-Hikers rear subframe like our S14. This bracket just goes in and allows a normal tie rod end at the back. Okay, so the next thing to put in is the lower control arm. One thing you will notice is for these rose joints to go into position correctly, they actually need to be angled, and what I mean by that is like that. They don't go in dead straight, they're on an angle to begin with, which doesn't matter because that's how these joints are designed to work. So we did our measurements of this based on the factory arm, or very close to it, made a couple of slight adjustments to get it right, and then obviously measured the other arm off the first arm so we can kind of have a good starting point. The other thing you need with these lower control arms is you've got to put a spacer in, because the distance in here where the arm goes is a little bit bigger than the distance here, so we just need to put a little washer in there to get the spacing correct. Now, just got to bend that over to bring it over to here like that. Looks a bit weird to begin with, why it doesn't line up, but that's why. All right, next up, traction rod. Compare it. Tell you what, these are zinc coated nuts and bolts are coming in pretty handy and looking pretty good now. So where the camber arm joins to the subframe, you would normally have an offset or eccentric bolt like this, which is used to adjust camber. Now that we have adjustable camber arms, there's really no need for it. And to be honest, these are known to come loose and slip in extreme sort of circuit and track applications. So instead of using that, GK Tech offers these, which is basically a replacement eccentric bolt. So they have this thick billet washer, which is just straight through the middle. So a normal bolt goes in, so you no longer can adjust your camber on those eccentric bolts anymore. It's all done on the arm. All right, next up, we're going to put the rod for the ball joint in. We need to use a rattle gun so we can tighten it up, otherwise it's going to free spin. So what I'm going to do is push that all the way through so you can see where it's meant to do up. Get that on. And on the other side, put on the bits that you need. So, what order do you put it all in? Well, it doesn't really matter if it's all kind of loose really, because you can manipulate it pretty well. So, last time I did the camber and traction rods first, so we'll stick with that. Now, in case you're wondering why I've put the eccentric bolt through this bush where the tie rod end joins to the knuckle, it's just purely because that's the last bolt that I have left that's been zinc coated. So it doesn't work as an eccentric bolt when it's through here because there's no little spot for the eccentric washer to go. So while it's through here, it's just a bolt. Now, something I wanted to touch on really quickly while we're here again is our solid subframe bushers. In the last video we talked about those. We said that it lets you raise the subframe 25 millimeters, which lets you lower the car 25 millimeters. Some people took that literally, but what it really means is, as you can imagine, when you raise the subframe in the car, the coilover attached to the knuckle is going to stay the same. So you don't actually lower or raise the car at all. But what it really does is it lets you lower the car 25 millimeters on your coilover without changing the suspension geometry from factory. Why is that a good thing? Well, it's to do with bump steer and the camber curve. Basically, when the car factory sits, maybe not all the way down, but around about there, it sits, you can see that the toe arm and the camber arm, most of the things actually slope down a little bit. But as they come up, essentially what happens is the toe and the camber changes dramatically, but it actually gets worse the further you go up. So if you start here in a slammed car, you start here, you have a really bad camber and bump steer curve straight away. Essentially, it's changing the alignment. So as it squats, in a lowered car, you get really bad bump steer and it actually gets toe out, which makes the car unstable. But if you start further down closer to factory, that first part of the movement, you do get toe out. It's just not as aggressive to begin with. So all the way down here, I've got heaps of toe in right now. By the time I get to about here, I've still got toe in, but when I get all the way up here, it's gone to massive toe out. There's a huge change in that part of the curve compared to the first part of the curve. So by raising the subframe and lowering the car 25 mil on the coilover, suspension is where it was before, which is exactly where you want it, because obviously the factory knew what they were doing when it came to suspension geometry. So everything you do to raise the subframe and also put a drop spindle on a knuckle, which you can't really do in a GTR because I don't think there is one, but there is for Silvia, is essentially lowering the car without changing the suspension geometry from factory because it is best. Why? Well, if you can imagine when you accelerate, if you get toe out during acceleration, what's going to happen? The back wheels are facing out, mega unstable. That's bad for handling. It's even bad for acceleration in a straight line. You do not want toe out in a rear-wheel drive car pretty much, well, ever, or any high-powered four-wheel drive car for that matter. Lower-powered motor kind of stuff, different story, but we're trying to avoid toe out. So we have toe in statically. We want it so when it squats, it never goes to toe out. So the more you can reduce that bump steer and reduce the camber curve in these things, the better. The subframe bushers help with that, so that's good. So our rear suspension is all together in our subframe. It's actually quite pretty and mesmerising to look at. It's almost a shame it's going to get filthy dirty when it goes racing. What do we still need to do from here? We've got to put in our diff, we've got to put in our drive shafts, we have to reassemble the drum handbrake assembly, and then we're going to do the R35 brake conversion on the subframe outside of the car, which will be pretty cool for you guys to see. Obviously, we've got the R35 front brake conversion to do as well, but that's all coming up in a future episode. See you then.